YouTube world. Hello. So, um, it's a bit late or early, depending on how you want to look at it, for me to be doing a live stream. But we've had an election in BC, and I want to discuss the election results because there's a lot to think. There's a lot to take note of and to ponder. I should start by saying I have been so incredibly disconnected from this election. I don't remember, no, it's not just that I don't remember. There's never been an election in my adult life that I have been so absent from. I didn't even vote. I did not even vote, and I really wasn't paying attention to the campaign. I almost forgot that today was election day. So, I'm just so disconnected from it. And I don't know if other people have been feeling that way or not. I don't have any reason to think that. But it's just, if the way I look at it is, if voting was actually able to create meaningful change, they would ban it. We're not going to get change through voting. That is apparent to me as someone who has gone across the political spectrum. Most of my life I've been supporting the NDP, so I would have identified as left wing. Then the left wing went batshit crazy in response to Trump a few years ago and started being violent even. And so the violence was too much for me. There was already a lot that I didn't like, but the violence was the final straw. So I walked away from the left and was on the right wing for a little bit of time and supporting the People's Party of Canada and Maxime Bernier. There was a lot of shenanigans going on with the emergence of that party as well, that new party. And, free speech is pretty much my biggest issue. And but I found the right wing to be just as hostile towards free speech as the left wing, at least in terms of social media platforms. So, and in terms of politicians as well, I don't think, and this is about BC, but I don't think that Trump supports free speech. I really don't. It was under his watch as President of the United States that I lost my free speech. I had a measure of free speech before Trump came into office. And he's not just the President of the United States. He is considered to be the leader of the so-called free world. And he did nothing while free speech was taken away. And his social media platform that he's created, okay, that's not free speech. That is not free speech. What, so different politicians have their own social media platforms and people just live in these bubbles, these silos? That's not free speech, okay? But I'm really getting off topic here now because I should be focusing on BC. But I've been around the block on politics from left to right and back again, and not back again, left to right, and I'm now consider myself to be beyond left and right. I don't identify with either side. I think that just about all social issues have more than two sides to them, and so the whole idea that there would be two main sides, left versus right, I think that that's problematic in itself. And so I am post left and post right. I'm post binary politics. I just don't I don't believe in either one. And I don't believe that any of the parties in BC or in Canada for that matter are going to be able to do anything to improve anything. Like, I just think they're totally ineffectual, um, and actually forces for negativity, if anything. So I prefer to stay out of it in terms, like, I mean, I'm going to comment on it and talk about it. I'm involved, but in terms of directly being involved in politics, no, I want to stay out of that because I don't want to, by voting, it's like you're legitimizing that system, and I don't want to legitimize it by casting a vote. Okay, it's a corrupt system that is not, it's not meant to work. It's that way on purpose. It's not meant to work. So so it doesn't, and so I'm not going to legitimize that by casting a vote. Um, when I used to vote, I was incredibly naive. I actually thought that something could change or that something could be accomplished through the political process, and maybe something could be accomplished in the past, but not anymore. Okay, so let's look at this. So we basically have a tie between the NDP, incumbent party, left-wing party, and the Conservatives. Now, what's really the news here, though, I mean, I'll show the numbers in a minute, but it's basically a tie. There's no clear winner. There's going to be recounts for weeks, months ahead, and we're not really going to know. We're in for a period of political uncertainty. But it is still very much a changed political landscape in BC after this, now that this election is over. And the fact that BC has a viable Conservative party that is winning seats, let alone vying to form government and tied with the governing party, incumbent party, in terms of the vote count, the number of seats they've managed to win. The fact that they have a political presence in the province of BC, the Conservative Party, that is the big news. That is the big news. There's never been a viable Conservative Party in BC in my lifetime. Straight up. So it's a new political landscape because now all of a sudden BC has a Conservative Party that is a force to be reckoned with. So, in case people don't know, it is very much a two-party system in BC. I mean, I'm oversimplifying. There's a handful of other smaller parties as well, but it's basically always been a two-party system and a back and forth exchange of power between a left-wing party and a right-wing party. The left-wing party is the NDP. The right-wing party constantly changes its name. And I suppose maybe that's one way of looking at this. But they are different characters, though, as well. So, up until this election, the right-wing party in BC was the BC Liberal Party. Okay? So I know that can be very confusing to people who are not from BC, or especially if they're not from Canada. That can be very confusing because people hear the word liberal and they think that means left-wing. Well, it actually doesn't. But, I mean, in the it's come to be associated with that, especially in the United States. But in BC, you can call it. Sometimes they call themselves the Free Enterprise Coalition. The right wing in BC has coalesced under the banner of the Liberal BC. I'm talking provincial politics, not federal Canadian politics. All these parties are legally separate once you get to the provincial level from the federal. Okay, so when I say NDP, I mean BC NDP. They are separate from the federal NDP. Okay, they are loosely associated with them, but they are separate. Same with the Liberals. So the BC Liberal Party really, legally speaking, is a separate entity from the federal Liberal Party. Of course, there's lots of backroom movement between the people, but legally it's a separate entity. So maybe I should say this in chronological order. Like, how did this all come about? So, in the 80s, when I was a kid, yeah, there was the NDP, would have been the left-wing party. They were in opposition, okay, when I was a little kid. And then the right wing was under a party called Social Credit. There was a party called the Social Credit Party. I mean, it sounds like a left-wing party. Also, that name too. But that was a right-wing party. And I remember in the 1980s, they were in power with a very charismatic Premier Bill Vander Zalm. Okay? And I'll talk forever if I start talking about all that. But that was the right-wing party. Then, you know, as parties do, they ended up getting the rot and started to pile up, and they started to become mired in scandal and controversy, and they lost to the NDP in the 90s, early 90s. I think it was 91. And they then, how did it go? They ended up becoming the BC Liberal Party. The Social Credit Party is now defunct, no longer exists, and the people who identify as right-wing coalesced under a new banner, the BC Liberal Party. Okay? And the NDP were in power for 3 terms in the 90s. Throughout the 90s, they were in power in BC. It was their heyday, really. And it was in the year 2000, I believe, or it might have been 2001, when the NDP finally lost to the BC Liberals. So the BC Liberals now formed government for the first time. Yeah, it was 2001. They formed the government for the first time ever under that banner. But, you know, a lot of their supporters previously were going under the Social Credit Party, which no longer existed by this point. Okay, so now that's the BC Liberal Party in power, was as a right-wing party with Gordon Campbell was the premier. And then they were such a rotten party. Oh my God, let me tell you. And they were in power for 16 years. I can't even remember how many elections they won. It was more than 3. I think they won like 4, maybe even 5 times. But they were just so terrible. They were so terrible. I mean, they held minimum wage at $8 an hour throughout almost throughout the entire time that they were in office. Whereas the rest of Canada provinces had increases to their minimum wage. It was only in the final years, after Gordon Campbell was gone, did the minimum wage start increasing in BC. And but that's not the only thing. That's minor compared to some of their other things. I mean, they demolished the Little Mountain Housing Project, which to me is unforgivable. That's what my thesis is about. They oversaw the BC turn into a money laundering capital, international money laundering capital, especially for money that was being smuggled out of China in violation of China's capital controls. And this money was being laundered in real estate in BC and also in through casinos. And all sorts of shady practices were springing up when the BC Liberals were in power. There was all sorts of shady financial institutions. I mean, BC is actually a very, very corrupt province. And it's, you know, second home to a lot of very wealthy but shady international tycoons, especially again from China. And these people basically flout the law, and they only ever seem to get in trouble when the US authorities decide that they've gone too far. When the BC Liberals were in power, you'd sometimes read an article in the Vancouver Sun about how the American authorities were arresting someone who, was based in BC and was involved in international money laundering. I mean, and then if the American authorities are arresting someone and holding someone accountable for financial crimes, and that person may go to jail for quite a long time, well, that stops that person from being active in Canada as well. So for a long time, our only hope of having any kind of rule of law being enforced around financial crimes was if the Americans got involved. So BC, I mean Canada in general, is just corruption runs rampant, but BC especially. I mean, they call it Bring Cash. BC stands for Bring Cash. Yeah, and you're going to need it because just to have a roof over your head is very, very expensive. A lot of, professionally employed people with good salaries can't afford the housing costs in Vancouver. I mean, it's that bad. So, and that's part of the reason why there's a doctor shortage, because even doctors can't afford the housing. They might be able to afford some ghetto housing, something terrible, but most people who go to medical school, they want something better than that. So but it was really under that 16 years, from 2001 to 2017, when the BC Liberals were in power. I would say that was the time period when BC made the full transition to being a banana republic, and that was just such an awful period in the history of BC. I don't think I'll ever recover from what happened during those years, and they really brought down the living standards for the average person in this province under the BC Liberals. And so they're gone, thank God. They lost an election. Well, this article kind of explains it. They lost power to the NDP, who came in 2017 very narrowly. They did not even have enough MLAs. They're called MLAs, members of the Legislative Assembly. They barely had enough MLAs to form a majority government. They didn't. But combined with the Green Party, which had a handful, maybe 2 or 3 MLAs, they were able to form a coalition and take power and form government with the BC Liberals in opposition. And so that's how it's been since 2017. There was another election in 2020, and in that election, the NDP did win a clear majority where they did not need to be involved in a coalition with the Green Party any longer. And then also that's when David Eby became premier. So David Eby has a background coming from the downtown east side, advocating for street drug users as a lawyer. Okay, and it was under his watch that drugs were decriminalized. Okay, so now here we are. He's in this election of 2024. David Eby has made a dramatic about-face, a dramatic shift in policy. He built his name and his career around advocating for street drug addicts. But now all of a sudden he's saying he's opposed to decriminalization, and he thinks that those with addictions should be forced against their will into treatment. I mean, he's just done a complete 180 on issues that he's been involved in for his entire life, or his entire career. So I mean, it makes me just question, does he stand for anything? If you could pivot that strongly, that quickly on your entire life's work, do you even have any principles? Do you stand for anything? Anyways, let's look at this article here. It's just a screenshot of it, so I need to show you. You can actually get the article going. Okay. So BC election results, race too close to call as shadow of 2017 looms large. Voters failed to deliver a clear result Saturday with the NDP one seat ahead of the Conservatives and a handful of recounts possible. So the NDP were sitting with 46 and the Conservatives were sitting with 45. This is a party, the Conservative Party, that up until now had no seats. Okay, they had no presence on the political landscape. So, I mean, they may not have won the election, but if there's any winner for tonight, it would have been the Conservatives. That they exist now as a political presence in BC. BC United did not run any candidates in the 2024 election. I mean, that is spectacular. So the BC Liberal Party, that corrupt party that was in power for 16 years that I was just talking about, then ended up losing to the NDP and the Greens in 2017, forming opposition. Well, just before this election, they changed their name, so no longer to be called the Liberal Party. Then they changed their name to be called BC United, only to not run any candidates. Like, they just don't exist anymore. I guess the right wing has made another one of these pivots, another one of these changes, right? Like how it was in the early 90s when it was Social Credit Party, and then it took a few years. I'm summarizing things. It took a few years for the right wing to kind of coalesce again in BC, and this time under the BC Liberal Party banner. And I suppose something like that has happened again now. So the right wing coalescing now under the banner of the BC Conservative Party, which up until now has existed. Legally, there's been a party in existence, but it's just been a placeholder. For that name. It was not a political force at all. So the right wing has reassembled, coalesced itself under this new banner of now being called Conservatives. I mean, at least they're being honest about it. They were always conservative. They could have been called Conservatives when they were under the BC Liberals. It was confusing. It was actually very confusing that the right wing party was called the Liberal Party. I mean, they were trying to trick people. Straight up. They were trying to trick voters into making them to think that they weren't as right wing as they really were by calling themselves that. Anyways, uncertainty looms over BC as voters delivered a split decision Saturday and razor-thin margins in 3 ridings where recounts will likely determine whether the NDP or Conservatives form the next government. Well, I think the Conservatives deserve it for their stunning arrival on the scene. There's also the possibility that the balance of power will rest with 2 newly elected Green Party MLAs. It's very likely. The scenario has echoes of the historic 2017 election when the BC Liberals, under Christy Clark, won 2 more seats than the NDP, but had government ripped away from them by the Greens. Right, so this is something like people have to understand about how the parliamentary system works. So it's very different from the American presidential system. So, yeah, the Liberals had 2 more seats than the NDP in 2017, but the NDP and the Greens combined had more seats and were able to form a coalition government. As of late Saturday night, the NDP had been elected or were leading in 46 ridings. The Conservatives were holding 45. and the Greens had elected 2 MLAs, even as their leader, Sonia Furstenau, fell to defeat in Victoria Beacon Hill. So, I mean, if those results stay the same, I would say it's very clear that the Green Party does hold the balance of power. And so whoever the Green Party wants to form a coalition with, and not just the Green Party, these 2 MLAs hold the balance of power. So if they decided that they wanted to work with the NDP would stay in power in a coalition with these 2 Green MLAs. Or it's possible that they could work with the Conservatives and form a coalition with the Conservatives. So they'll be the kingmaker, basically. With 93 seats in the BC legislature, 47 seats are required for a majority government. None of the record 40 independents were elected, but some could serve as spoilers in ridings such as Vernon-Lumby, where the NDP were narrowly ahead of the independent Kevin Acton, had over 15% of the vote. The results could change in the coming days with the ridings of Wondifuka-Malahat, Surrey City Centre, and Surrey Guildford, too close to call and possibly subject to automatic recounts. The margin between NDP and Conservative candidates in those ridings is less than a percentage point. Okay, so those are difficult ridings too. NDP leader David Eby acknowledged that the Conservatives had spoken to some of British Columbians' frustrations around public safety and affordability. He nevertheless believes voters delivered a majority for progressive values and committed to working with the Greens, despite his party calling a snap election in 2020 to get out from under such an arrangement. Right. We need to support people with the cost of daily life. We need to make life more affordable for British Columbians, and we need to make communities safe for everybody, he said, and we will do these things. Rustad, meanwhile, promised to keep up the fight and said that the election has forever changed the political landscape in BC and believes that the recounts could fall his way. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The political landscape has been redefined. I mean, it has a Conservative Party now. This Rustad guy was, I don't even know anything about him. Like, he was a nobody before. If not, he said he will make it as hard as possible for the NDP to carry out their agenda and bring them down at the first opportunity. We are going to continue this fight over the next days, over the next weeks, over the next months, he told supporters. We're going to fight every single day to try to make sure that we do everything we can to improve the lives of people in this province. For her part, Furstenau expressed disappointment with her defeat, but also optimism that her colleagues Jeremy Valeriot of West Vancouver Sea to Sky and Rob Botterill of Saanich North and the Islands could play a pivotal role in the legislature. This is the passing of the torch, and I'm going to be there to mentor and guide and lead in any way I can, she said, while remembering her own role in the 2017 negotiations that saw the Greens partner with the NDP because she couldn't stomach working with the BC Liberals. I don't blame her for that. At the end of the day, voters are still left to wonder who will be charged with addressing their concerns around affordability, healthcare, and public safety at the conclusion of an election season characterized more by negative campaigning than policy commitments. It is now up to Lieutenant Janet Austin to decide who to call on for the first chance to form government. By convention, it is expected that she will give Eby and the NDP the first opportunity, but they will either need to gain a seat through recounts or garner the support of the Greens in order to do that. Right. Voters who headed to the polls in Metro Vancouver and on Vancouver Island contended with an atmospheric river on Saturday that flooded homes and swept away cars. Elections BC said the inclement weather dampened turnout in some ridings, but overall, around 57% of British Columbians came out to cast a ballot. About 1 million of those ballots, representing around 28% of the registered voters, were cast in advance polls. Okay, so I don't know why they call it an atmospheric river. It's raining. But, yeah, the NDP have performed terribly. They had a majority in 2020, and they've lost it. That's really the outcome. And I mean, they've just done terrible. They've really been terrible. I think David Eby needs to resign, because what does he stand for? If you built your whole career off of advocating for street drug addicts in the downtown east side, that's what you've built your name on. You come into politics, you decriminalize drugs in small quantities so that addicts no longer have to fear being arrested by the police or anything, only for a few months later to have a complete shift and say we're going to recriminalize it again, and not only that, we're going to force people into treatment against their will. Meanwhile, the healthcare system can't even treat people who want to be treated for common ailments. Again, under David Eby's watch, it became that way. It wasn't like that before. You know, the NDP's strong suits should be housing and healthcare. That should be their. That's like, they're known for their largesse, for spending money on social programs, and so where is it? Why haven't they? The healthcare system is worse under since the NDP have been in power than it was when the BC Liberals were in power. The housing situation is by far worse under the NDP now than compared to the BC Liberals. And it's not because the NDP are inherently terrible. Both of those areas were doing just fine when the NDP were in power in the 90s. Okay. But David Eby, I mean, flip-flopping on an issue that has defined his career leaves me wondering, what does he even fucking stand for? Because it's also not class politics, which is something else that the NDP used to stand for, but they've all but abandoned that. I mean, I guess they stand for identity politics. Yeah, they stand for race baiting, basically. I mean, they don't even stand for gay identity politics. They stand for transgender and race baiting. And I don't think that's enough to cut it with voters in BC. I honestly don't. And but that's not what David Eby was known for before, like when he was building up his name as a lawyer. And what was some other horrible things that have happened under the NDP? Well, like, they formed a partnership with Airbnb, like, where Airbnb, a percentage of the money that Airbnb makes in BC would be put towards an affordable housing fund, but it was like an official partnership between the BC government and Airbnb. Like, holy fuck, Airbnb is part of the reason why housing is so expensive in BC, because there's so much of it that is not being used for the local people. It's much of it is just sits empty, okay, or in the case of Airbnb, it's going to be rented out, but as short-term stays for tourists. Okay, that's not housing stock that is for the local population then. So the Airbnb should have been banned, okay? Like, hotels are a special category and they get regulated as hotels. Airbnb is trying to take housing that's from the dedicated residential pool of housing and basically using it as a hotel. Well, then be a hotel then, bitch. Like, and be subject to those regulations. But, that should have been banned, not with forming a partnership with them. And what was the other thing? The health minister, NDP health minister during the COVID pandemic, his outrageous comments about the Crystal Mall in Burnaby, which is a Chinese mall, like very Chinese mall, like it's like, it's not like Chinatown, it's like an actual mall like that you would see in China, okay? And so the vast majority of the people who go to that mall are Chinese people. And Adrian Dix, the health minister, was shaming people during the COVID pandemic, shaming people if they did not want to go to the Crystal Mall, and was in the newspaper bragging about how he eats his lunch there every single day. Basically implying that people weren't going there out of racism against Chinese people in the context of the COVID pandemic. And Okay, but the vast majority of people who go to that mall are Chinese. So if the mall had a decline in people going there during the COVID pandemic, it was because Chinese people had stopped going there. White people or other races of people basically never went there in the first place, hardly at all. So how could so were Chinese people being racist against other Chinese people? No, they were trying to prevent themselves from getting COVID. Okay, and probably Chinese people were the most plugged into the risk, the most aware of the risk in the early days. After all, it wasn't even acknowledged that there was a pandemic going on until partway through 2020, even though the pandemic had been raging in China in 2019. And many local Chinese people were aware of that because of their connections with China. And so they didn't want to go out much, including not to go to the Crystal Mall. And that was somehow twisted around as though it were white people trying to avoid Chinese people out of racism. Like, it was just ridiculous. And, on that subject, though, I mean, I think I had COVID in 2019, just towards the end of 2019. But that's never been officially recognized because it's always been said that it didn't come here until 2020 and that Washington State and Italy supposedly had COVID before BC did. Yeah, fucking right. They just didn't want to acknowledge that it was happening. And they wanted to use it as an opportunity to virtue signal on race and be involved in race baiting politics. And, it was in this context when the NDP set up a hotline for people to call in to report incidences of racism. And it was in this context when, what was it? Was it the Wall Street Journal or some American newspaper published an article about Vancouver calling it the anti-Chinese hate crime capital of North America, which is just so ridiculous. So ridiculous. People here have been very kind and very accommodating to immigrants from around the world, including those from China, often to our own detriment, because it's a huge source of our housing woes. But there has not been a response of racism or an outbreak of racism against Chinese people as a result of that. And to portray it as though there was, I mean, it's just nuts. It's just nuts. I think the BC NDP are more concerned with presidential politics in the United States. Honestly, I do, than to do with anything to do with BC issues. Yeah. And on that note, I do think that whoever forms leader, can we change the date so we have a fixed election date in October? So we're going to have this coming up again in October 2028. And as long as I don't necessarily have a problem with fixed election dates, but can we make it to be a different date? Because with this date in October, it means that BC election campaigns are always going to be fought in the shadow of American presidential campaigns, which take up all the attention. So that would have, if you want the citizens to be engaged in politics, have the election happening not at the same time as the U.S. presidential elections, especially involving Trump. Okay, have it at a different time of year. Yeah. Oh, another example of how the NDP have failed. They couldn't even fucking come through on their campaign promise to what is it called? Scrap. I think you would phrase it as scrap daylight savings time. Basically, get rid of the need to change the clocks twice a year. Yeah. So they campaigned, that was one of their campaign promises. I believe that was for 2017 election. They still haven't done it. They still haven't done it. So, like, they can't come through on anything. And the things that there should be their strong suits, like housing and healthcare, are raging out of control, and the NDP of BC have no answers effectively other than to stir the pot on racial tensions, which isn't even a big problem in BC. So I just think that with this kind of a poor result, and then all that flip flopping and waffling on issues from David Eby, I really think that David Eby needs to resign as leader, and go from there. So, but I mean, there's the real takeaway news here is that BC now has a Conservative Party which is a viable force politically speaking. And so I'm not going to have to do, thank God, I'm not going to have to do this song and dance every time I try to explain politics in BC to people who are not from here. I'm not going to have to anymore explain how the Liberal Party is really the right-wing party. That's over. The Conservative Party is the right-wing party. BC has a Conservative Party that is a viable force and that is electing MLAs and that is actually vying to form government. All right. That's all I have to say for now. Peace out.